offthehooksports.com wants to take a look at SEC haters. SEC haters. So suddenly you have found some SEC haters. And you're pointing towards a tweet by Nicole Arbach. I believe she is with The Athletic, Caleb. And what is the hate? Where is the hate coming from? Because it not only speaks to potential hate of the SEC, it also speaks to, Caleb, in my opinion, the direction of college football and where it's going. And it's going to be vastly different. So, what did Nicole Arbach, to my best knowledge, no relation to Red Arbach, but what did she have to say concerning the SEC and why it could be hate-filled hatred speech?
It is hate speech towards the SEC, and it is totally unjust. And now I say this as someone who sat in this chair last week and lambasted Greg Sankey for not having his team together, if not having his guys together, and lambasted the SEC for its lack of competence, and lambasted the way they're cheating the fans by not going to 9 games. But she wrote an article suggesting that the College Football Playoff Committee should place more emphasis on strength of schedule, and then said the strength of schedule would be whether or not Power 5 conferences play 9 or 8 conference games because they play one more Power 5 team. That is dumb. Okay, I'm just going to say it. That's dumb. Fact of the matter is, would you rather play a 9-game conference schedule in the Big Ten West or an 8-game conference schedule in the SEC? Or
why don't you just make it even more simple? Would you rather play a 9-game permanent setup in the ACC or an 8-game in the SEC East, West, or Big Ten East? I mean, is that kind of what you're saying? The ACC, you'd rather play the permanent opponents there, correct?
Yeah, exactly. You'd rather do the 9-game setup in the ACC. Because a lot of those teams are, one, it's lazy to just separate by Power 5 and non-Power 5. Because then we should be separating by SEC and non-SEC. Because I'm just going to tell you guys this. The Pac-12 is a lot closer to a Group of 5 conference than it is to the SEC. So the idea that the Pac-12 is better because they play 9 games versus the SEC is a ridiculous way to approach this. Even if the SEC should play 9 games.
Okay. So to me, there are two completely different conversations going on. Whether you want 8 or 9 teams depends on what you think of the annual rivalries, correct? So if you have 9, you're going to have your Georgia, Auburn, Tennessee, Alabama forever, correct?
Correct.
And then they throw in, for some reason, LSU, Florida, which wasn't a rivalry and probably still isn't. It's a neat game to me because there's a lot of talent on the field. But those are the ones you want to keep. But aside from that, if you add a significant opponent that is a non-conference opponent, you're still going to have a tough schedule with whatever the SEC and Big Ten lay out in front of you. For the most part, you're going to have years in which I think Tennessee has a good draw. You're going to have other years in which other teams in the Big Ten or SEC has a big draw. But I want to look at this philosophically, Caleb. Do you think the college football community is ready for a real championship contender to be 9-3 going into the playoffs? I'm not talking about somebody that slips in, but a real contender, just like we've seen at the NFL. I remember the Giants when they got in as a wild card team and they had that underrated defensive line and that Eli Manning that ended up with a helmet toss but didn't make a lot of mistakes. Are you cool with a team like that having a realistic shot? That's what you have to ask yourself. Do you want your contenders going 12, 13-0 or 11, 12-1, or do you want your championship contenders to be flawed, have 2 or 3 significant losses on their schedule? I'll go ahead and tell you, I am fine with the latter. I'd rather see the Austin Peay's come off the schedule. No offense, Austin Peay. I would rather see those all be filled by significant opponents and a 9-3. You look back and you say, wow, that 2025 team from wherever went 9-2 or 9-3 and made a real run at the championship game and almost beat Team X to make it. I'm fine with that. To me, that can define a successful season. It doesn't have to have a 1 or a 0 after the win total.
Yeah, I'm fine with the latter because that's the only feasible way to do this. Because quite honestly, even in the SEC, within the context of the SEC, 12-0 and 9-3 is not it's not going to look much better than 9-3 depending on the schedule you get. There's going to be a team that gets a draw one year where they're not playing LSU, they're not playing Alabama, and they're not playing Georgia. And then they go 11-1. And then another team plays all three of those and goes 9-3. Are we really to believe the 11-1 team is better at that point? And so you have to do it this way because of the way they've set it up. I don't think the SEC champion, to me, philosophically, is not going to be legitimate anymore because it's going to be totally based on the draw you get with your schedule.
Well, okay, for next year, maybe. I don't know how they're going to split ties. That's a whole different conversation. But let's assume that it's going to be divisions down the road. So let's look at the Big Ten.
Oh, no, they're getting rid of them.
Yeah, I mean, I think they are getting rid of them. But let's look at the Big Ten with division still, correct?
No, they're getting rid of it next year when they do they're doing the flex schedule. Their divisions are gone.
So with the flex schedule, okay, whichever the case may be, let's say Penn State loses a close game to Ohio State and Michigan. Then if that's a 12-team playoff year, let's say next year, 2025, they've got every argument to be in there if the rest of their schedule is unblemished. Let's say Tennessee loses their permanent opponent is going to be, let's say it turns out where it's going to be Vanderbilt, Kentucky, and Alabama. Let's say they lose a close one to Alabama. They slip up and they lose a game to Kentucky, and they're sitting there at 10-2, and they're not playing in the SEC championship game. That is a team that get ready for itself. You never thought I would say this. You lose to Kentucky, you still have a right to get in a 12-team playoff. That is the new standard for excellence. It's going to be winning 9 or 10 games or better and being right there knocking at the door. It's not going to be lose one game against Florida in September and the rest of the season is over, Caleb. Those days are over.
Yeah, they're completely gone. And look, I'm not so sure that's the part I don't love because that was the best part of the sport. I mean, if you go college football, it's the only sport. If you were to take a sport and rank the 50 greatest games in the history of that sport, college football is the only one where at least 90% of them would be regular season games. I mean, that Alabama-Auburn game of 2013 is the greatest game I ever witnessed. The kick six game. It was one of the most exciting things I ever saw. And the way college football is going, that game doesn't matter. The result of that is irrelevant because they would go to the playoff.
But what if that team like Auburn was knocking at the door to get in the playoff and they beat Alabama and they're suddenly hosting, they're suddenly getting a bye, and Alabama is the one that maybe has to travel and doesn't have the bye. I still think that game means a whole lot. I agree that it's not one game and you're out like the Tennessee-Florida series in the 90s in September, but it still means a lot. I think you're too easily dismissing what a loss would mean to a championship resume.
I think it's borderline turning into UNC Duke in basketball, which everybody loves that rivalry, but then you're like, oh, they're both going to the tournament. Who cares? And so,
no. But if on that last weekend in the ACC tournament, I know what you're talking about. If North Carolina loses to Duke, maybe they drop a seed, maybe, but probably not. Their seed's pretty much set at that point.
Yeah, and you and I both know the selection committee does all their work before the last week anyway.
Yeah, I mean, I think Tennessee, Georgia is still a huge game, even if it's played in the last game of the regular season. I think it's still a monstrous game. I just think at the end of the day, you walk away from there and you think, oh, the loser can still slip into the playoffs and make some noise. I don't think that's a bad thing.
Well, here's the other flaw, and this is the funny thing. So this came out, the Big Ten is at 9 games with the flex schedule. There are 3 Big Ten teams that could go undefeated next year. I forget exactly who they were, but theoretically, you could have 3 Big Ten teams go undefeated. With the SEC at 8 games in no divisions, it'll probably be like 4 or 5 SEC teams that could theoretically go undefeated next year. What happens when you do that? What happens when you have 3 undefeated SEC teams and 2 undefeated Big Ten teams? Who's the champion? Do they share the conference championship?
Okay, in all fairness, though, history is on my side. and I've thrown things out there just like that. What happens if everybody's undefeated? Typically, it doesn't happen. Teams stumble, and that ends up happening. But we do have that conversation in October, like, well, what if Ohio State, Michigan, Georgia, and Alabama are all undefeated? Well, it doesn't usually shake out that way, in all fairness. I get your point, but it doesn't usually shake out that way.
There was a year, I distinctly remember, there's 2 years I remember. One was the SEC.
I know one that you're going to point to. Go ahead.
The 03 SEC East three-way tie? Yes, that Georgia got the nod over, which honestly, if you look at schedule strength and toughness of divisional opponents, Georgia deserved the nod. Sorry, Tennessee fans, but Georgia did play a tougher West schedule than Tennessee played that year. They deserve the nod. And then the other one, though, that was big was Oklahoma, Texas, and Texas Tech had a three-way tie. All one loss beat each other in 2008 with the Big 12. Oklahoma got the nod. And look, this is where the 12-team playoff helps because all three teams would get in a 12-team playoff at that point because you can't. There's no real effective way to determine the division winner. I am saying, though, there is theoretically a situation where this could happen. The year Ohio State won the national title in 2002, we forget this, but they had to split the Big Ten title with Iowa that year because both teams went undefeated in Big Ten play and didn't play each other. And so they had to share the title.
So I got two Daves in my head right now, which is scary in and of itself. And one Dave is the new Dave is beating down the old Dave. And the old Dave used to say that, yes, you had to go through and prove your dominance now. And you had to be able to tell everybody that, hey, this is who we are. I'm this team. And you also wanted a tough non-conference schedule like Miami coming in the house. You wanted those teams. You wanted Notre Dame. Well, here's what New Dave is telling that Dave.
Why don't you shut the hell up?
Okay, because New Dave's telling old Dave the schedule is tough enough. You're going to get respect. Sorry to the fans that actually buy the tickets. Sorry to the fans that pay for the parking pass. You don't matter anymore. Sounds awful, but it's true.
Hey now.
Because right now, if Tennessee has to play 8 or 9 difficult opponents or any other SEC or Big Ten team for that matter, that's enough. Don't care if it's 8 or 9. Schedule Southern College. Schedule whoever you have to. Austin Peay. I know it sounds terrible for the walk-up fan, and I am sorry. I have been a guy on campus that loved the fact that Tennessee played a great schedule week in and week out, that loved the fact that you got to see Miami's when I was covering Tennessee as a member of the media. Love to see all that. But as for now, New Dave is saying,
you suck.
Because I'm telling you, you don't need them. You win 8 quality SEC teams. I don't care who the other 4 teams are. You can make them Carnes High School and beat the mighty Giroux. And if you beat the mighty Giroux and 8 other SEC teams, you are still going to the college football playoff. So I'm sorry, walk-up fans that don't want to see Tennessee hammer some team by 50 points, but that's where college football is. It is right now. And those are the games you should schedule. Don't schedule the difficult games anymore and make the college football playoff. Sorry, New Dave just destroyed old Dave in an old-fashioned brawl on Cumberland Avenue. That old Dave didn't win a lot anyway, so good job, New Dave.
Dave, I will tell you this. It's funny you say that because a lot of college football fans try to hold 2 thoughts in their minds. And what they don't realize is the 2 thoughts they hold are directly contradictory. One thought they have is they want to support the smaller schools. You know, they'll be like, look at the group of 5 or Division II. It's not Division I, but it's good football and we should enjoy it. And then at the same time, they'll say all the Power 5 teams should play each other. And it's like, well, wait a minute. The only reason these smaller schools exist is because Tennessee writes a giant check for them to come to Neyland Stadium once a year so they can go there and lose by 50. And that funds their whole athletic department. And, you know, you won't have smaller schools that kids could go play football at unless you have these bigger schools allowing them to come to their stadium, paying them the money, and letting them lose by 50.
Okay, so Tom says rewarding mediocrity. No, I don't think that's the case. I think an 8 or 9, whatever it shakes out to be in 2025, 2026, that's difficult enough. I actually think that you're asking too much of a college athlete that he should have to play. What are we looking at? We're looking at 12 regular season games right now, correct, Caleb?
Correct.
So 12 times 4 is 48 difficult quarters. You shouldn't ask a college athlete to play 48 difficult quarters. If you add 4 so-so teams that you might have to go out there and play the first drive of the second half, then that lops off 2, 4, 6, 8. Then you're asking for 40 difficult quarters.
I'm going to push back, though.
Okay, let me just finish with this point.
Oh,
I
sorry,
think you should have games that you go out there and you take care of business in the first quarter and the second quarter, and then you don't even know where your helmet is in the second quarter or the second half, third quarter, because they have taken it away from you because your services are no longer needed. That's where I think they should be.
There is one giant flaw with this, though, and it's something that applies to Tennessee, and it's why they actually need to schedule at least one big name out of conference team every year for home and home.
I'm fine with one, but that no more.
Okay, but the reason they might have to do this is the reason it might apply to them is when you go to the 3-6 format, which I still think they inevitably will. They couldn't figure it out this year, but they're going to go to that format.
And describe for those that don't know what the 3-6 is.
3 permanent opponents every year, home, and then the other 6 rotating. So a 4-year player would go to every school at least once and host every school once, and then 3 permanent opponents they play at home twice and on the road twice. Those 2 road games that you play permanent matter, and here's what I mean for this. Tennessee's 3 opponents are going to be Vanderbilt, South Carolina, and Alabama, or Vanderbilt, Kentucky, and Alabama. I'm sorry, Dave. That's a really big recruiting disadvantage that they can't go to Georgia every other year, that they can't go to Florida every other year, that they can't go to Louisiana every other year, and that they can't go to Texas every other year. They need another. I mean, schedule Florida State home and home. They got to get into those states more than just once every 4 years.
I understand that from a recruiting perspective, but I'm sticking to schedule. 8's tough enough. You do not need to schedule 2 or 3 other quality opponents. I'm sorry, walk-up fan.
No, you're right about that. And that's what made me so angry about this article was it's, okay, if you're playing 8 conference games and your conference games are LSU, Alabama, and Georgia, and you're going to honestly tell me with a straight face that's easier than a Pac-12 team that plays 9 conference games because they have to play Washington State as their 9th conference game? Like, that's ridiculous. And I'm sorry. It's insane when people get mad about the 8. Look, I wanted 9 games. Dave, you wanted 9 games. I thought it was better for everybody if we got 9 games. But the idea that the SEC is somehow easier than other conferences because they're playing 8 games is laughably not true. And it kills all integrity. And it's also lazy because people are making this assumption that all Power 5 conferences are one tier and then all Group of 5 conferences are one tier, as if the Pac-12 and the SEC are the same tier. Okay, first of all, we just had like 6 Group of 5 teams join Power 5 teams in the Big 12 and the Pac-12 this year. So how are we to believe that those conferences are the same tier as the SEC? They're not. Or the Big 10 for that matter. I'm not trying to be an SEC homer. They're not in the same tier as the Big 10 either.